since most of the people here are students or my young colleagues, if I may be allowed to say so, I don't think the student operator needs any introduction. There's a good number of you, either with me or by yourself, have read his books, at least the Science and the Origins of Modernity Volume 1, which at some point was on our reading list last year, or papers from other important publications or collected volumes of papers. And it's my pleasure to introduce two talks that Stephen was so kind to this kind of first talk, which we baptized somehow ad hoc, the seminar, the CELTIS seminar. CELTIS is the Center for Logic, History and Philosophy of Science, Research Center for Logic, History and Philosophy of Science. And this first talk was initially designed to be a bit more interactive, a bit more student-oriented, a bit more like a graduate seminar. In the end, it's more like a talk. It's also recorded for the benefit of students who cannot attend. It will be on the website of the University of Bucharest, and so it will be a talk tomorrow. It's a bit of a premiere for us to do this recording. Don't pay too much attention to the camera, and of course you're invited to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Taryn. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's lovely to be back. Well, I'm going to talk today about representation. And the focus of the talk is on the prehistory, if you like, of representation in the 17th century. Representation became a problem in the 17th century in a way it had not been previously. It became a central epistemological problem of perception, of understanding the world, got thought in terms of the notion of representation, and epistemology began to centre around representation after Descartes, and really up to the end of the 18th century. I don't want to talk about these developments today. I want to talk about the prehistory, because what I want to show is that there are a number of issues that feed into the problem of representation in the 17th century, and these are not integrated in any sense. They come from quite different sources, and a lot of the problems that one subsequently encounters in the 17th and 18th century around representation can be put, I think, can be put down to the fact that the issues have such heterogeneous sources in the first place. Well, by the end of the 17th century then, representation had become a fundamental problem in epistemology, in natural philosophy, in mathematics, and in a number of other areas. And in asking how this situation came about, I want to identify a number of initially independent strands which were merged, but which were subsequently never wholly reconciled with one another, with the result that the problems of representation that came to the fore in the 17th century had a multi-layered structure. And this gave rise to a number of anomalies and intractable problems. And there are four strands leading to the 17th century understanding of representation that I'll identify as particularly important. And these derive, respectively, and I'll look at them in turn, from rhetoric, from optics, from scholastic psychology and metaphysics, and from mechanics. Okay, let me start with the problem of representation in rhetoric. Rhetoric had an indispensable role to play in the development of early modern natural philosophy, early modern sciences that subsequently came to be thought of. But it's crucial that we be precise as to what this role is. We want to avoid the implausible extremes here. Those who argue, for example, that science is just a form of rhetoric, on the one hand, and those who argue that rhetoric has always been completely irrelevant to science on the other. Early modern thinkers dismissed what they thought of what they construed as the purported explanations of Aristotle's natural philosophy, they dismissed them as empty and circular. In one important respect, this criticism was based on a misconception, because the model that the Aristotelians followed was one in which the aim of the exercise was not in fact explanation, but demonstration. That is, an account of the phenomena that derived them deductively from first principles. Nevertheless, however one characterises what they rejected, early modern natural philosophers were seeking forms of explanation that offered something more than had traditionally been available in the Aristotelian tradition. They stressed genuine informativeness and associated this with features such as clarity, relevance and transparency, features they thought were missing in traditional Aristotelian forms of what they construed as explanation. Above all, they sought explanations that were compelling. There was one discipline that dealt in detail with how to frame compelling arguments, namely rhetoric, a staple of the curriculum of every 16th and 17th century schoolchild. If the new demands placed on explanation were to be met, the resources provided by rhetoric were crucial. Rhetoric not only taught how arguments could be made compelling, but more importantly, they taught how this varied with subject matter and audience. It was in the flexibility represented in these respects that made rhetoric such an invaluable source for exploring what explanatory techniques might best be deployed in areas like natural philosophy, medicine, mathematics, very varied areas. Now, in the humanist tradition of the 16th and early 17th centuries, rhetoric stood in for philosophy. It functioned in a way parallel to metaphysics in the scholastic tradition. The two conceptions of philosophy that resulted were very different. The humanist one, where rhetoric was crucial, and the scholastic one, where metaphysics was crucial. They were very different, yet they were both fostered in a culture which had been dominated by Aristotelianism. As a result, both can be seen to take their starting points from Aristotle. But there the similarity ends. Scholastic metaphysics had its origins in the 12th century attempts to provide a philosophical basis for Christian teaching, partly to provide a shared platform on which to counter heresy and non-Christian teachings, and partly to help resolve conceptual difficulties on questions like the Incarnation and the Trinity. Once scholasticism became allied with Aristotelianism in the 13th century, then, due to the perceived strengths of Aristotelianism over Platonism in providing the conceptual resources to deal with theological problems, the core concern became this: the reconciliation of Aristotelian natural philosophy and Christian teaching. The inconsistencies between the two systems, notably on the questions of the immortality of the soul and whether the world had a beginning, were to be resolved by metaphysics. Metaphysics was conceived by Aquinas as a neutral discourse which could adjudicate the claims of Aristotelian natural philosophy and Christian theology. There was a shared conception both between this and between the later Scotist conception of metaphysics. There was a shared conception of metaphysical understanding as the primary form of philosophical understanding. To do philosophy was to do metaphysics. They were the same thing. The role of Aristotle in the humanist tradition is completely different from this. What's at issue here was discovery or invention. At its most general level, the task of rhetoric was the formulation, organisation and expression of one's ideas in a coherent and compelling way. It was designed to help find one's way around the comprehensive body of learning built up from antiquity, to recognise where appropriate evidence might be found, where appropriate arguments might be found, and to provide models which were designed to give one a sense of what was needed if a particular question was to be investigated, or a particular position defended. And these were models that would be shared with those to whom one was expounding or defending one's case. Rhetoric was designed to help one focus one's mental powers in various ways, to organise one's thoughts in the most economical fashion, as well as providing models to show one how particular kinds of case were best defended, depending on such questions as the availability and complexity of evidence, and the state of knowledge or prejudices of the audience towards which one was directing one's arguments. Now, at a very general level, rhetoric was indifferent as to subject matter, in that very comprehensive procedures were recommended that would aid one's investigations or one's case, irrespective of whether one were conducting a scientific investigation or a legal one, for example. Although at the specific level, there would be similarities or analogies and dissimilarities between legal cases and scientific cases. The law, taken in a broad sense, was very much the paradigm case for rhetorical writers. Rhetorical treatises were often seen as being explicitly directed towards lawyers and legislators, and examples were geared around the kind of problem case that arose in law. In the light of this, it's only to be expected that using a rhetorical model for knowledge is in many respects using a legal model. Now, the rhetorical tradition in the 16th and early 17th centuries, while it takes Aristotelian questions as its starting point, is one generally indebted to Roman writers rather than Greek ones. Its concern is with practical rather than speculative questions, and psychology replaces epistemology in certain fundamental respects in thinking about how the mind works in a cognitive context. It's in these very distinctive conditions that the question of representation comes to the fore in rhetoric. What's at issue is a psychological theory of rhetorical invention. And the most important source for this theory was Quintilian, whose works were second only to those of Cicero in the 16th and early 17th century educational systems in Europe. The Roman rhetorical writers took up elements from the psychological and poetic theories of their predecessors, as well as from their rhetorical works. Paramount amongst these earlier authors was Aristotle, and in the writings of Quintilian we can find elements not only from Aristotle's rhetoric and poetics, but also from the Nicomachean Ethics and the third book of the De Anima. In particular, Quintilian is concerned with the qualities of the image, which the search for and presentation of images that are distinctive in their vividness and particularity. A number of rhetorical and psychological concerns meet here, and it's a distinctive feature of Roman writers on rhetoric that psychological categories are used to provide a basis for rhetorical ones. This being nowhere more true than in Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria. Now, the very possibility of this whole approach derives initially from Aristotle's defence of the emotions. Whereas Plato had banished the emotions from the rational mind, Aristotle had shown in the rhetoric and in the poetics how the emotions have a crucial role to play in judgment. Correlatively, in response to Plato's doctrine that art is mere mimesis, he had elaborated the doctrine that in tragedy, for example, what we're presented with is not simply a set of empirical falsehoods, but something which investigates the causes of human behaviour by abstracting them from particular circumstances and presenting them in a universal way, which makes it possible to capture features of character and intentions which are normally obscured. The drama does this by moving the audience to fear and pity. Now, to defend this view fully, what's needed is a psychological theory of the emotions, and more generally of judgment. And this Aristotle provides in the third book of the De Anima. An important part of this account takes the form of a theory of the image-making capacity of judgment, something which Plato had a low opinion of, but which Aristotle sets out to defend. The imagination, fantasia, Aristotle tells us, functions like sense perception. It works with the images that enable the mind to think. And I quote from the De Anima, and for this reason, unless one perceived things, one would not learn or understand anything. And when one contemplates, one must at the same time contemplate an image. The images are like sense perceptions, except that they are without matter. Now, the Roman rhetorical tradition was especially concerned with such images, and above all with the question of what features or qualities they must have if they're to be employed effectively in convincing an audience. Whether one's an orator at court or an actor on stage, Quintilian says, our aim is to engage the emotions of the audience, and perhaps to get it to behave in a particular way as a result. What one must do if one's to achieve this, on Quintilian's view, is to transform the psychological image, the phantasma, into its rhetorical counterpart, the icon. What Quintilian is concerned with, above all, is the evidential quality of images. What the orator needs to do is to exhibit rather than display his proofs. Cathy Edens noted that the debt of Aristotelian psychology to the fundamentally legal model of judgment and action re-emerges here as a reciprocal relationship. To influence the outcome of a legal judgment, the goal of the orator, Quintilian's forensic image relies on the power of the psychological image, which as far back as Aristotle has directly affected the judging power of the soul. Conversely, to perform its office, the image requires, even at the psychological stage, the vividness and palpability characteristic of real evidence in law courts. In other words, the power of the image to move the mind to a particular judgment relies on the property it shares with real demonstrative evidence to bear on the outcome of a legal trial. Now, there are striking parallels here with Descartes' doctrine of clear and distinct ideas. Just as Aristotle and Quintilian are concerned with the vividness and particularity of the images employed by the orator or dramatist or lawyer, so Descartes is concerned with the clarity and distinctness of the mental images he refers to as ideas. In both cases, there's some variation in terminology. Quintilian talks of both vividness and particularity and vividness and palpability. And Descartes talks of clarity and distinctness, clarity and vividness, clarity and simplicity, and so on. But nothing hinges on this. Descartes certainly knew Quintilian's texts. In the 5th year of his studies at La Flèche, he would have been required to study the Institutio in depth, and may well have been required to memorize passages from it. And among the Greek texts he would have been required to study was Aristotle's Rhetoric, with its detailed discussion of the kind of vividness directed towards the senses rather than the intellect. Now, rhetoric took over what had traditionally been conceived to be the concerns of logic in a number of areas. And this is most evident in the case of what was called invention. That is, the discovery of those arguments needed to convince an opponent, starting from shared premises of some case that one wants to establish. Aristotle had discussed this question in a broadly scientific context in the Topics, but by the 16th century the models for such conviction were drawn exclusively from rhetoric, and principally from Quintilian. Quintilian had devoted a great deal of attention to discovering those arguments likely to lead to conviction in areas such as legal argument and political oratory. And indeed, if conviction were one's aim, then such techniques are, it's true, more likely to be of use than an understanding of which forms of syllogism are formally valid. This doesn't mean that the espousal of rhetoric carried with it a disregard for valid arguments, for it didn't. It just meant that validity was regarded merely as one ingredient in a good argument. Although Aristotle's syllogistic deals with probabilistic forms of argument and accepts that arguments may be valid without being formally valid, it is above all a theory of formally valid inferences. And an understanding of formally valid inferences is not something that one is likely to find especially useful in trying to convince a difficult opponent of some contentious conclusion. It's far from clear that logic, understood as the theory of the nature of formally valid inferences, is of any use by itself in changing someone's mind about a conclusion, or that it's of any use in enabling us to understand why someone has changed their mind as a result of being convinced by an argument. The first question seems to fall rather under the category of techniques of persuasion, and the aim of rhetorical theories is precisely to capture and elaborate upon what kinds of techniques of persuasion are best fitted to different kinds of situation. This does not prevent logical considerations being brought to bear, but these will be paramount only in those cases where deductive certainty can be achieved, and such cases are not likely to be common. The second question, that of how argument can change beliefs, is a much more difficult question to deal with then as now. But with the rhetorical tradition, drawing on Aristotelian and occasionally on Stoic psychology, there had been attempts to provide some account of how our ideas might be compared in terms of their vividness, for example. And it's not too hard to see how a notion such as vividness might operate as a rudimentary criterion for the replacement of one belief by another. Although this topic was not pursued in any detail in antiquity, there are explicit 17th century accounts that show how the theory works. Malebranche, for example, in his theory of the will, when tackling the problem of how we're to resist a lesser good which tempts us in favour of a greater good, tells us that what we must do is to represent the greater good to ourselves as vividly as possible, so that it becomes more vivid in our mind than the lesser good. The suggestion being that once the balance of vividness has been tipped, we'll automatically assent to or wish for the greater good. Indeed, this is a problem that exercised Descartes, but Malebranche's account can be seen as a later development within Cartesian psychology. Although it's treated in epistemological psychological terms, its ultimate source lies in the rhetorical psychological theories of Quintilian. One very important respect in which the context of the accounts of writers such as Aristotle and Quintilian and that of Descartes' account differ is that in the former case, conviction is conceived in discursive terms. In the case of Aristotle, this is as true of logic as it is of rhetoric, drama, and legal pleading. Aristotle conceived the dialectical syllogism as being designed to induce conviction in an opponent. He conceived the demonstrative syllogism as being designed to induce conviction in a student, and so on. The context of argumentation is discursive, in the sense that ones are always arguing with someone on the basis of shared premises. That's how Aristotelian logic works. For unless there were shared premises, the argument could not begin. In rhetorical, dramatic, and legal cases, the situation is even more straightforward. For here, what one is doing is directed towards an audience. And in Quintilian, where oratory virtually takes over the whole question of inducing conviction, conviction is clearly directed at an audience. Descartes' conception of conviction is different from this. For Descartes, the central task is to convince oneself, and only once one has done this does one try to convince others. Now, the question that naturally arises here is whether a theory devoted to considering how one goes about convincing an audience of something, on grounds that may not always depend on the truth of what one's arguing, could possibly form the basis for a theory about what characteristics of ideas enable us to recognise their truth, which is what Descartes wants. Well, the answer is that the first theory can be used in the latter case. What we must focus on is psychological content. Psychological theory about questions of judgment were transmitted to the modern era, above all in the form of rhetorical theory. And of great significance here was Quintilian's treatise on oratory. There can be no doubt that this could have played a crucial role in Descartes' thinking about judging the truth of theories in terms of their clear and distinct perception of ideas. On Quintilian's account, and here he follows Aristotle, vivid illustration, evidentia, of the facts, quote, goes beyond mere clarity, since the latter merely lets itself be seen, whereas evidentia thrusts itself upon the attention. But how do we achieve this evidentia? Well, the answer is given in Quintilian as follows. It says, if we wish to give our words the appearance of sincerity, we must assimilate ourselves to the emotions of those who are genuinely so affected. And our eloquence must spring from the same feeling that we desire to produce in the mind of the judge. Will he grieve who can find no trace of grief in the words with which I seek to move him to grief? It is utterly impossible. Fire alone can kindle and moisture alone can wet, nor can one thing impart any colour to another save that which it possesses itself. Accordingly, the first essential is that those feelings should prevail with us that we wish to prevail with the judge, and we should be moved ourselves before we attempt to move others. Quintilian then goes on to ask how we generate these emotions in ourselves. And there follows his account of the evidential quality of images. The crucial point that I want to draw attention to here is that unless one is already convinced by one's own images, then one will not be in a position to use them to convince others. So, self-conviction is a prerequisite for the conviction of others. And self-conviction, like the conviction of one's audience, depends on the qualities of the image, amongst which must figure clarity and vividness. Now, Quintilian's is not a doctrine that derives from considerations about our cognitive relation to the world. Rather, it's one that's concerned with the evidential quality of images. Nor is it one that concerns itself so much with absolute certainty as with conviction. And the mental images it works with are not the highly abstract ideas of Descartes' later metaphysical and epistemological writings, but vivid pictorial representations. And here I think we have the key to Descartes' doctrine of clear and distinct ideas as it emerged in the 1620s. It's a model of self-conviction along the lines developed by Quintilian that's effectively taken up by Descartes in Rule 3 of the Regulae, when we're told that what we must seek is something we can clearly and evidently intuit, and that the mind that's clear and attentive will be able to do this. Although the early rules draw their model of knowledge almost exclusively from mathematics, the point is that the doctrine of clear and distinct ideas is exhibited paradigmatically in the case of mathematics, not that it is somehow derived from mathematics. Mathematics is the showcase, if you like. It's not the source of this. It might seem peculiar that a conception based on such a strongly pictorial model of representation should find its paradigmatic manifestation in something as abstract as mathematics. But problematic though this is for Descartes, it's not especially surprising. In the earliest writing that we have from him, the Compendium Musicae, clarity of representation, which amounts to favouring that pictorial form of representation in which differences can be detected at a glance, is the focal point of the treatise. So the representation of musical intervals, for example, is not represented as a ratio of numbers, but rather as a pairing of line lengths by arithmetic proportions, a very visual, pictorial representation of harmonic relations. Moreover, in the Cogitationes Privatae, which is roughly contemporary with the early rules, the image-making power of the imagination is made the basis for the operations of reason, and indeed its power is extolled above that of reason. The idea of this image-forming power being at the centre of cognition is very dominant in Descartes' thought at this period. Generally, in his writings at this time, for example, Descartes does not use the term imaginatio and its correlates to indicate simple operations. Rather, he uses them to denote active, exploratory, investigative processes, visualizing geometrical constructions, visualizing the end of apparently infinite processes of division, applying mathematical constructs to physical problems, or the power by which a listener is able to synthesize a unity out of the discrete parts of a song. Okay, optics. In the case of rhetoric, what we needed to understand is how an account of vivid pictorial representation which thrives in a rhetorical context can continue to function in an epistemological context which is devoted to very abstract matters. In the case of vision, the problem is the opposite. It's not that of understanding how notions of representation can be transferred from one context to another, but rather that of understanding why a representation comes to be introduced into a discussion in which questions of representation have been at most very marginal. The appearance of such questions in theories of visual cognition results in large part from an appreciation of the key role of refraction in vision. This appreciation dates effectively from Kepler's Ad Vitelionem Paralipomena of 1604. Before then, questions of representation are tangential to the study of visual cognition as such. Whereas from 1604 onwards, they gradually become central, indeed constitutive of the study of vision. The dominant theory of vision up to the 17th century was that of Aristotle. Aristotle offered a comprehensive theory of perceptual cognition, one that unified physiology, psychology, metaphysics, and natural philosophy into a broad and powerful theory. Specifically, it comprised a theory of the nature of luminous bodies, a theory of the transition of light, and a theory of the action of perceived qualities of the eye, all incorporated into a general account of the function of visual perception. At the core of his treatment lay a theory that each sense organ has its own special sensibles. That is, things or properties or qualities that are perceived by one sense organ only, into which that organ is naturally adapted. So colour, for example, is a special sensible because it's perceived by vision alone. Aristotle argues that when the sense organs are perceiving their special sensibles, their perception is incorrigible. And there are two connected reasons behind this. First, he has a thoroughly teleological conception of perceptual cognition. On his account, we have the sense organs we do because they naturally display to us the nature of the world. Each sense organ is fitted to receive one specific kind of sensible, and the natural function of sense organs is activated when they're actually perceiving their respective special sensibles. When each sense organ functions properly, it fulfills its purpose properly, since otherwise nature would have made an imperfection in a fully developed organ, and Aristotle thinks that's not possible. Secondly, perception of special sensibles is incorrigible for Aristotle because it's constitutive of the very notion of veridicality. Vision under optimal conditions is the only criterion we possess by which to judge whether something has a particular colour, for example. To view something under optimal conditions is to meet all the relevant conditions by which colour is to be determined. There simply is no other test. This theory of visual cognition is not representational. Vision is not mediated by visual representations. The crystalline humour of the eye takes on the qualities of the object seen. It takes on, literally takes on, the shape and colour of the object seen, for example. And seeing consists in having this image in the eye. The image is not a representation of the shape and colour of the object. It is the shape and colour of the object, because these are part of the form as opposed to the matter of the object seen. The form of something is what makes it what it is. Its matter doesn't play any role in this. So when the eye takes on the form of the object seen, it in effect becomes that object. One has the object itself in one's mind. It doesn't have the matter of the object, obviously. One has the form of the object, and that's what the essence of the object is. It's actually in the mind. Whether a perception is veridical is to be decided, at least in the simplest case, on the grounds of whether I've satisfied the criteria for successful visual discrimination. I'm healthy, I don't have jaundice, I have good eyesight, the lighting is excellent, there's no intervening medium, and so on. Note that on this account, the details of how vision occurs are subordinated to the question of the role and function of visual perception. This latter is construed teleologically. Nature's provided us with the sense organs we have so that we can know the world. In other words, various basic tenets are taken as given from the start, in such a way that it would be impossible for empirical details to dislodge them. But this teleological understanding of vision dictates that, in the case of successful vision, there is a strict resemblance between the object in the world and what we see, because it's actually there in the mind. What Kepler's Ad Vitelionem showed was that, from the point of view of optics and ocular anatomy, this was just not possible. The image of the object seen was located not in the three-dimensional crystalline humour, a jelly-like mass able to take on the three-dimensional form of the object, but rather on the retina, which is a two-dimensional flat surface. Moreover, the optics dictated that the image on this flat two-dimensional surface was inverted, because light rays, parallel light rays, passing through the convex lens of an eye must cross, which means that the orientation of the image must be inverted. It's a matter of basic optics. Although, now Aristotle's account of vision had bypassed optical considerations altogether. Although what he calls species from the object are transmitted through the medium, separating the object and the eye, this was not a transmission of light, but a transmission of form or species, to which the laws of optics didn't apply. It might be thought, nevertheless, that the point about the image forming not on the crystalline humour but on the retina would be decisive. But this is not such a straightforward empirical matter. It's not as if the seeing eye was dissected and the image located. The question was intimately tied up with the role of optics in understanding vision. Nor does the fact that spectacles had been used to correct vision since the 13th century decide the point in favour of optics taking a leading role. Aristotle's theory is one about what happens under optimal conditions, conditions fixed by nature so that the sensory organs that nature's provided us with function as they're supposed to. Spectacles can be treated simply as a means of securing optimal conditions in cases where the eye is defective. The account of what happens under optimal conditions is not affected by considerations of how we secure these conditions in cases where the acuity of our eyes has diminished because of age, for example. The choice then is not between a theory that gets the optics right and a theory that gets the optics wrong. The choice is between an account of vision to which considerations of optics are irrelevant and one in which they're effectively constitutive of our understanding of vision. Kepler's account of the eye formed one chapter of Ad Vitellionem, which was above all the defence of astronomy. Tycho Brahe had originally assigned to Kepler the task of defending astronomy against the Aristotelian attacks by Ursus, who had claimed that the heavens were too distant to be observed properly. Therefore, astronomy is a waste of time. These things are too far away. Kepler's response is to argue that what we're concerned with in vision is light, no matter how distant the object seen. And light does not decay in being transmitted from a distant celestial object. Rather, it's dispersed, and this is something which geometrical optics can deal with in a precise way. What light produces is an image, whether in the eye or on a piece of paper, which he places in his so-called ecliptic device for projecting an image of the moon. This is like a V-shape, two pieces of wood in a V-shape. The light comes in a slit in one of them, and the light is focused on a piece of paper, an image, a piece of paper on the other. And for observations of the moon, this gives you a nice steady picture that you can use to draw it. It gives you an image. Indeed, the illustrations for the key work in the tradition of geometrical optics, Descartes' La Dioptrique, and here you have the relevant picture in front of you, these show the eye and its retinal image completely disembodied. This eye is not in someone's head, this is optics. The head of a viewer is added as a spectator in the process. This is not his eye, this is someone looking on at this optical process. The optical study of vision is about optical images, which despite the role they play in visual cognition, have an identity in their own right, which connects them to the images of the moon that appear on a piece of paper placed in Kepler's ecliptic device. The images could be on the retina, they could be on a piece of paper, they could be on a mirror, it doesn't matter. You're dealing with an autonomous discipline, optics, that studies the qualities of the optical image. The images are inverted and of varying degrees of clarity, and they're two-dimensional images on the eye. Kepler in Ad Vitellionem and Descartes in La Dioptrique established that vision is about optics, and optics is about the production of images. In other words, it's about representation. And questions of veridicality and accuracy arise in a representational context, that are wholly alien to Aristotle's understanding of vision. There were, it's true, attempts to reconcile optics with the Aristotelian theory of vision, notably in Jesuit authors such as Christoph Scheiner. Scheiner conceded that the image was not formed on the crystalline humour, but on the retina, and that the humour was actually the lens, which he believed, which focused the species on the retina. And in fact, Kepler has still employed the vocabulary of species, but not consistently. And it's clear that he's talking about light rays, whereas Scheiner is unambiguously working within an Aristotelian context. What's interesting is that Scheiner, in his reformulation and updating of the Aristotelian account, Scheiner can't avoid questions of representation. Paramount among these questions is that of mediation. On the Aristotelian understanding, veridical perception is unmediated perception. The thing itself is made present to the eye. By contrast, once the discussion proceeds in terms of retinal images, refraction is essential to produce the image. Vision without refraction is impossible. Unless the light rays are focused by the lens of the eye, one doesn't see anything, except maybe shades of brightness. In Aristotelian terms, such refraction is a form of mediation, which meant that what the new optical writers such as Kepler and Descartes were claiming in Aristotelian terms was that vision is essentially mediated. The question then arises what epistemological role this mediation plays. In particular, where instruments with lenses such as telescopes yielded information that contradicted that of unaided vision, as telescopes did on the relative magnitudes of celestial bodies, it was no longer a question of comparing mediated with unmediated vision, as some Jesuit critics of Galileo were inclined to argue, but rather of just what forms of mediation were legitimate and what were not. Here we have one of the core issues in the 17th century debates on the nature of representation. Okay, scholastic psychology and metaphysics, and I'll be more brief in this than the last question. A very different kind of concern with representation, one that works very much within the context of Aristotle's theory of visual cognition, is to be found in late 16th and early 17th century scholastic writers, who were concerned with epistemological problems within the context of Aristotelian metaphysics. The core question that arose for them was that of the representational nature of ideas. Their interest in this issue had nothing to do with optics, but was generated directly by metaphysical and epistemological considerations internal to Aristotelianism. To understand what's at issue, we need to say a little more about the role of species in the Aristotelian account of perception. In his discussion of sense perception in books 2 and 3 of De Anima, Aristotle argued that in perception, quote, the mind which is actively thinking is identical with its object. In the case of perceptual cognition, where knowledge is of sensible things, this clearly cannot mean that sensible things are in the mind. Hence the importance of the doctrine that the essence of something lies in its form, not in its matter. And what's in the mind is the form of the object. Now Aquinas, in his elaboration of this account in the Summa Theologica, argues that the form of the thing known, quote, must of necessity be in the knower in the same manner as in the known itself. And so the sensible form, quote, is in one way in the thing which is external to the soul, and in another way in the senses. The intelligible species that the intellect receives from objects in sense perception are not forms produced by the mind, but by the thing itself. And indeed they are the things itself in the intellect. When you know something or perceive something, you have it in your intellect, because you have its form in your intellect. These things really exist in the intellect because the thing is essentially its form. But when the intellect takes on this form in cognition, what it takes on is the same form as the object. It's identical with the object. Not with the matter of the object, which is irrelevant to its essence, but with its form. Okay, now the complicated bit. Just what it was that was present to the mind in this kind of account was disputed amongst Aquinas' successors. particularly Duns Scotus and Suarez and their followers. By the late 16th century, one pressing issue was that of the conformity between the object, or what the conformity between the object and our idea of it consisted in. What marked out the true idea of something? Two kinds of concept, a formal concept and an objective concept, were postulated. And the question of true ideas was considered to lie in the relation between the formal concept and the objective concept. The formal concept of an object was that object as it existed in the intellect. But formal concepts are not necessarily true, because sometimes you can have mistaken concepts. To say this is to say that they don't conform to the object of which they are the concept. But the object's a material thing. How can the idea conform to something material, they asked? The problem's compounded by the fact that many scholastic writers denied that we have genuine access to essences, but they had no doubt that we had access to truth. Where could this truth derive from, if not from the object itself? So it's getting very messy. What was needed was something immaterial that stood in for the material thing, so that it could be compared with the formal concept. This immaterial thing is the objective concept, and it's the thing insofar as it's known. So what we compare the formal concept with is not the thing itself, but some intermediary, namely the objective concept. The relation is labelled, this leaves the question of what the relation between the objective concept and the thing itself is. And the relation is labelled objective being. But what exactly this is very obscure. It's tempting to think of objective being in these terms. It's just the relation that would have held between the formal concept and the thing itself had it not been for the problem that we're comparing unlike entities, in that one's corporeal and one's intellectual. In the case where we routinely grasp essences in sense perception, that's what the relation would be, and it would be comparatively straightforward. But it's clear that sense perception is fallible, and we hardly ever grasp essences in this way. And this is the problem, this is what gives rise to all the complexities in the scholastic account. It's important for the late scholastic writers that this does not mean that our formal concepts are all or even largely false. The tripartite formal distinction between formal concept, objective concept, and object, and this is the interesting bit for us, this tripartite distinction opens up the possibility of introducing questions of degrees of certainty. Now, degrees of certainty were commonplace in the rhetorical tradition. They thrived on questions of degrees of certainty. And they thrived in legal and historical disciplines based on university rhetorical and dialectical studies. But up to this point, questions of degrees of certainty were completely absent from scholastic accounts of sense perception. But in the response to this problem that we don't perceive essences yet, how do we still know that we perceive truth? This question of degrees of certainty is opened up. Once the idea that in perception we grasp the essence of the thing seen has been abandoned, and the discussion starts to focus on the objective concept and its relation to the thing itself, the objective concept, and remember here we're dealing in scholastic metaphysics, the objective concept is effectively treated as a form of representation. So here we get a third, quite different kind of problem of representation. The objective concept is now treated as a form of representation. And the question of the degree of reliability of this concept, in its capacity as a representation, now takes centre stage. Subsequent scholastic discussions are concerned with the reliability of our concepts rather than with their veridicality as such. But everything nevertheless turns on the representative function of concepts now, which are treated as an intermediary between the object itself and the knowing mind. This is a distinctively epistemological approach, different from the notions of representation in the rhetorical and optical traditions. Okay, the final source. The three developments that I've identified up to this point turn on inducing conviction through verbal images, the optical production of visual images, and the relation of mental images to the world. The fourth development is separate from each of these. It concerns the question of explanation and demonstration. Here the problem areas are natural philosophy and mathematics. And in both cases, what's at issue is the role of picturability. And there are two basic questions. First, do we understand something better when we're able to picture it? And second, does being able to picture something constitute a demonstration of it? These remain highly overdetermined and unresolved questions. Consider the mathematical case first. The Greek and Alexandrian mathematicians had employed various heuristic devices in their attempt to deal with mathematical problems, but that always sought to present their results in formal terms. In the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, some attention began to be paid to trying to reconcile heuristic discovery methods and formal presentation methods. And various forms of demonstration had been singled out as problematic. And in some cases, issues of picturability are explicit. The formal geometrical legitimacy of proof by superposition. This is where the equality of two geometrical figures is shown by imagining one place over the other so that the boundaries exactly coincide. So say you've got two right-angled triangles and you want to say they're similar, they've got the same area, same size and the rest of it. What do? Well, in your imagination you can just flip one through the third dimension and show that it lies on the other. Or in the critical cases you can just move one and imagine it placed over the other. And if the sides exactly coincide, then that's traditionally taken as a proof that these are similar triangles. This begins to be questioned. It's questioned by Pelletier in his 1557 edition of Euclid. Here, picturing an operation being successfully carried out is not accepted as a form of demonstration. It's not that he doesn't think this works, he thinks this is not a rigorous form of proof. It doesn't give you absolute certainty. This case is problematic though, as Hobbes later pointed out. It's difficult to see how we could possibly establish equality except by these means. Yet the question is raised whether visually showing that something has the same area as something else is tantamount to demonstrating or proving that it's got the same area. So just because you can picture something happening, does that constitute a proof or a demonstration? The issues are complicated by the question of just what role picturability plays. If the appeal to picturability was an appeal to some intuitive spatial sense, then there was no shortage of examples where such an intuitive spatial sense fails. Consider the case of a square rotated around a fixed axis to generate a cylinder. So you've got a two-dimensional figure of a square, you rotate it in a third dimension all the way around and you generate a cylinder. If we now cut the square in half along the diagonal, we've got a triangle that stands in relation to the square in the ratio of 1 to 2. So we cut the square in half, we might even remove the top half so we've got a triangle. Now we rotate the triangle and generate a cone. The problem is that when we rotate the triangle and the square around the height of the square, the cone and the cylinder generators stand in a ratio of 1 to 3, not 1 to 2. The two-dimensional figures stand in a ratio of 1 to 2, but when you rotate them, they stand in a ratio of 1 to 3. Now, our intuitive spatial sense fails, well mine does, and I hope most of yours do, because mathematicians maybe it doesn't, because you can visualise relations between areas and volumes and things like the rest of us can't. But certainly, if it's intuitive in the sense of a pre-mathematical spatial understanding, then it fails. The standard way of proving the ratio of the volumes of cylinder and cone in Euclid is problematic as a demonstration, however. It proceeds via what are called exhaustion methods. Exhaustion methods are proofs by contradiction. We assume the opposite of the proposition to be demonstrated and show that it leads to a contradiction. Pelletier questioned whether showing that none of the alternatives hold is a legitimate way of demonstrating the truth of a proposition. The exhaustion method involves a double reductio. It's called an exhaustion method because you exhaust all the alternatives, so you're left with only one thing, therefore that must be true. The exhaustion method involves a double reduction. In a simple case, we're unable to prove that A equals B directly. So we prove that A cannot be less than B, and we prove that A cannot be greater than B. Now, the usefulness of this way of proceeding was not in doubt. It was extremely useful in a number of complex geometrical operations. But the question can be raised whether it has the formal rigour required of formal geometrical proof. In short, picturability construed as an intuitive spatial sense is not a reliable guide. But the idea that understanding how a result emerges, rather than simply being shown that the result holds, for example on the grounds that it's the only remaining alternative, showing how the result emerges as opposed to just showing that it's the case, showing how it emerges is a superior form of understanding. And this is one that, as it happens, directly connects with picturability. The question of demonstration and explanation in natural philosophy is different, and it goes to the heart of the legitimacy of particular ways of pursuing natural philosophy, invalidating not just results, but the whole program that generated them. There were 2 points on which early modern natural philosophers were agreed. The first was that the purported explanations offered within Aristotelian natural philosophy were completely lacking in explanatory power. They told us nothing. Hobbes, for example, ridiculed the Aristotelian account of vision by maintaining that the cause of vision is to be explained by bodies sending forth a visible species which are received by the eye. As he points out, that doesn't tell us anything. Descartes ridiculed the idea that motion was, quote, the act of being which is in potency insofar as it's in potency. Descartes says, well, I've read it in Latin, I've translated it into French, and still have no idea what that means. You haven't explained anything. Gassendi complains that Aristotelian explanations succeed only in making things far more complex and obscure. So in general, opponents of Aristotelianism had no difficulty showing the circularity and pathological awkwardness of such explanations. The second point on which early modern natural philosophers were agreed was that Aristotelian natural philosophy excluded what many now considered the most important class of physical phenomena, namely mechanics. Aristotelian natural philosophy had been premised on the idea that understanding the nature of something enables one to understand those of its properties that follow from its nature, and it enabled one to understand the behaviour that derived from those properties. The behaviour of bodies that's the result of contingencies or accidents in the world, behaviour that doesn't derive from something essential to the body, falls outside the domain of natural philosophy. Consequently, there are many physical processes in the world that are not explicable in principle in terms of Aristotelian natural philosophy. There is a natural philosophical explanation for why water pours to the ground when it's released from constraints, for example, but not for why and how it's lifted by a mechanical device, because that works against water's nature. Aristotelian natural philosophy deals with the natural behaviour of bodies, not with any other kind of behaviour they might undergo. But it was precisely these other kinds of behaviour that mechanics described. And 17th century natural philosophers not only saw mechanics as a legitimate part of natural philosophy, but increasingly as the model for the whole of natural philosophy. A key figure in this last development was Isaac Bateman, to whom Descartes owed his understanding of mechanical explanation, and who was Descartes' mentor in a number of respects early on. Though you never know this in anything Descartes writes. Rejecting Aristotelian and Neoplatonic notions of immaterial causes and agencies, on the grounds that they were unintelligible and hence useless in natural philosophy, Bateman insisted that natural philosophy work in terms of concrete, imaginable things and processes, rather than abstract entities. It was significant in Bateman's view that no one who had to deal with the practical workings of machines, and amongst other things he was laying the drains for breweries, no one who was familiar with the practical workings of machines would appeal to teleological processes, occult virtues, or immaterial causes to account for the functioning of a simple mechanical device. Explanations in the mechanical arts rested on an appeal to a clear picture of the structure and interaction of the constitutive parts of the apparatus. The simple mechanical and hydrodynamical devices showed only motion or pressure can produce the rearrangement of parts and hence produce work. And for theoretical purposes, the causes of motions and pressures are other motions and pressures. What Beckmann was demanding in natural philosophy was the application of the criterion of meaningful communication between mechanical artisans. The appeal to a picturable or imaginable structure of parts whose motions are controlled within his theory of mechanics. His central contention was that to talk about effects, you must be able to imagine how they're produced. And the exemplar of this resides in the mechanical arts, where one can command nature to macroscopic level. If you can't picture to yourself what's happening in a mechanical process, then you simply don't understand it, in Beckmann's view. And understanding is an obvious prerequisite for explanation. Now, mechanics was an inherently geometrical discipline, and geometry being the basis of all Beckmann's natural philosophical studies. But it's not just the application of geometry to mechanical problems that was at issue. There was something about geometrical processes that marked them out from Aristotelian demonstrations, and which geometry had in common with the explanations of the working of mechanical devices: transparency, picturability. In the case of mechanics, for Beckmann, this transparency consisted in a concrete pictorial grasp of the inner workings of machines. It was above all Descartes, however, who would attempt to make this conception stand at the centre of a general account of representation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very dense and enlightening talk. Let's try to formulate some clever or less clever questions in the next 30 minutes or so.
I'm questioning a little bit the resemblance between self-assurance in rhetoric and self-convincing in Descartes.
Right.
Because in the first case, as I see it, this self-convincing is just a temporary act. Because you could be a lawyer and argue for a false cause. In other words, so in this sense, you have to lie to yourself. Or you could be a sophist and take double discourses. While in the case of Descartes, this seems to be a self-assurance once and for all. So there seems to be something more in the case of Descartes, which could have something to do with mathematics, maybe mathematical certainty. It's not just a temporary self-conviction.
That's true. The crucial bit in Quintilian, though, that I want to focus on that Descartes gets is the idea that your ability to convince an audience of something depends on convincing yourself. That's the first step. So that's a crucial ingredient in Quintilian's theory. You can't convince other people unless you convince yourself. And the second question is, how do you convince yourself? You convince yourself with vivid pictorial images. So, and of course then you convey your argument to the judge or to the audience or whatever in terms of those images. So, yeah, this is conviction that might have nothing to do with truth in a legal case, for example. But that's not the point. The thing is, what you've got here is a psychological theory about what makes particular ideas and thoughts compelling as opposed to others. What makes them stand out? Now, my argument is that this is the theory devised in a rhetorical context where questions of truth, and as you point out, you're going for purely short-term arguments here, where the context of truth is not relevant. And what I want to argue Descartes does is transfer what he does is he transfers Quintilian's account of images, which is formulated in the context of self-conviction, to a different kind of self-conviction. What Descartes wants out of Buddhist ideas is that he wants a way of representing ideas in so clearly and distinctly that just by examining them, you can see whether they're true or not. Now, that's not something in Quintilian, but I think what he's using is this idea of clarity and vividness. He's using a rhetorical theory, or rhetorical psychological theory, about what it is that makes ideas compelling to an audience, that goes through a theory that what makes these compelling to me, and he translates that into a theory of what makes these ideas compelling to me when I think in terms of truth. So what he asks in the case of mathematics, for example, is there a way of representing mathematical operations such that it is, so that their truth or falsity is immediately obvious? If you use ordinary numerals, then you don't get that. So if you have 2 plus 3 equals 5, it's not immediately obvious that there's a truth involved in that. You have to understand the numerals, the plus side, the equal, and the rest of it, and the arrangement of numbers. Is there a way of representing that mathematical operation so that its truth is obvious, or evident? Yes, there is, says Descartes. You do it in terms of line length. So you can do it in terms of points. You have 2 points, you have 3 points, you bring them together, and you can see that by bringing them together, the sum is there in front of you. Without even knowing, you can do this with huge numbers, so you don't even know what the numerical value is. But you can see, you can visualize the operation, so to speak. That's a clear and distinct operation. That's his paradigm of clarity and distinctness and the early rules. So the idea is, can you present your ideas in such a way that you can see immediately whether they are true or false? And the answer is yes, if you do it in clear and vivid terms. And he does it in terms of lines being brought together in various ways, you can do it with points being brought together in various ways. And it works perfectly for simple arithmetical operations. Unfortunately for Descartes, he realizes it doesn't work with anything more complicated, and that's when he gives up the project. But the early theory of clear and distinct ideas, which then takes on metaphysical form, works in terms of a notion of vividness and pictorial vividness that I think he gets from Quintilian. You couldn't get it from maths itself, because Descartes' maths, remember, is quite different from traditional maths. So you look at standard maths textbooks, and they're on a Euclidean model in the 17th century. They start with basic axioms, premises, and build up, deduce more fundamental theorems. That's not how Descartes' geometry works, through no axioms and premises in it. It throws you straight into an unsolved problem and gives you problem-solving techniques by how to do it. Because Descartes thinks formal demonstration is for mathematicians a waste of time. You need to learn problem-solving techniques, not kind of showing things from first principles. So first, his conception of maths is at odds with the traditional one. But secondly, to get the clarity and distinctness, you don't deduce it like Euclid or Aristotle from first principles. You represent the processes to yourself in this clear and distinct way. So that's like Quintilian and not like traditional maths, is what I'd say.
What about the ego? Does it have a pictorial vividness?
In the reguli, at the end, in Rule 12 and I think it's Rule 14, either Rule 12 or Rule 14, you get a very peculiar account of understanding the physical world. What Descartes argues is that there are things in the world which can be construed in terms of just spatial extension. So you can think of the world purely geometrically in terms of spatial extension. And he thinks that this is how you represent the world to yourself in the imagination, which is a corporeal organ in the brain, the sensus communis or something like that. He also thinks that you have abstracted universals from this, and they're in the mind, or the ego, in the mind anyway. So you've got the world, the mind, and in the middle you've got the corporeal organs in the brain. And you've got the mapping, you've got a double mapping. You've got real objects in the world that can be represented in terms of areas and line lengths. Then he says these abstract things in the mind, you can't do anything with them unless you represent them in terms of determinate objects, because abstract things are not determinate. So you represent them in terms of determinate objects, and in the mathematical case that turns out to be line lengths. So you get things in the mind, you map them onto the brain, you get things in the world, they're mapped onto the brain, and the two go together in the brain. So in the reguli, the interesting thing is understanding doesn't take place in the brain, in the mind. It takes place in corporeal, pictorial representations in the brain, in the corporeal objects of the brain. You have a mind, but that's not where understanding takes place. It's where you have your abstracted universals. But if you understand the world, that's not where it takes place. If you want to understand non-corporeal things, maybe that takes place in the mind, but Descartes just doesn't have an account of that in the regula. I mean, it's a pretty compelling argument that you can't work with indeterminate things. You've got to make them determinate before you can do anything with them. Well, I don't know what pure intellectual understanding would look like on that. So at least in the early, up to the metaphysical works, the understanding takes place in the brain rather than the mind. Later on, it gets a bit messier. It depends what you look at. I mean, when you say the ego, do you mean the mind or spiritus?
Yeah, it seems to me that you are equating having distinct and clear ideas with having a picture of something. And then I thought, well, the ego is something that I have a distinct and clear idea, so it must be somehow a picture.
Right, okay, later on in the meditations, you have a metaphysical version of clear and distinct ideas, which is not pictorial, I agree. You have a clear and distinct idea of God, and that comes through in the ontological argument and the other. And you have, and the cogito ergo sum is supposed to work in terms of a clear and distinct grasp. You hear something you grasp that you know you couldn't be wrong about, and it's like that in the case. So it's the one thing that stops the regress of skepticism. The thing is that when Descartes returns to cognitive questions in Long and then later in the Passions of the Soul, he goes back to a much more naturalistic form of understanding, even for intellectual things. So the highly metaphysicalized version of the mind that you get in meditations is kind of an exception, I think. Remember at the beginning of the sixth meditation, he says, the mind, says something like, we shouldn't be misled here, the mind is not like a sailor in a ship. And if you've read up to that point, you think, well, that's exactly what the mind is like up to this point. The sailor in a ship is a really good image for the mind as we've got it up to this point. And it's as if Descartes kind of suddenly looks back at what he's done and panics and says, no, I didn't mean that, I meant something different. The mind and the body are intimately connected. I don't have an intellectual idea of pain and think, oh dear, I'm in pain. What affects my body affects my mind at the same time. Later on it gets messy. I'm interested in the pictorial stuff because this is actually an introductory chapter to the book on pictorial representation in the 17th century. So there's another chapter on Descartes. Then there's a chapter on, it's only 4 chapters, short book. Then there's a chapter on representation and picturability as evidence. So we look at John Gill's book. We look at Hooke on microscopes and telescopes. And Hooke has a problem in that in the case of microscopes, a microscopic image or representation counts as evidence for what is there. But the telescopic image, representation of the heavens, never counts as evidence for what's there. And he's stuck as to why you can have pictorial evidence in one case and not pictorial evidence in the other case. And then in the last chapter, I look at Newton versus Leibniz on the calculus. Newton argues that the calculus is an illegitimate form of mathematical operation unless you can give each stage in the calculation a geometrical representation. Because you've got to follow each stage. If there's something you don't follow, then the thing has lost its legitimacy. Whereas Leibniz says you can legitimate calculus at the beginning, but once you've done that, you don't need to and can't and shouldn't try to represent these things in pictorial terms, because here we have something that's so powerful it goes beyond our natural cognitive abilities. It's like, well, it's not Leibniz's image, it's mine. It's like someone having a telescope. You see all this stuff in the heavens you haven't seen before. You don't say it's illegitimate because it contradicts what we can see with the naked eye. This is like an extension of vision. It improves our vision. So Leibniz says in the case of calculus, this improves our cognitive abilities, improves our minds. So why I'm interested in picturability is not so much the epistemological problems as those cases in natural philosophy and maths where picturability really becomes a crucial issue. People are, in the Leibniz-Newton case, people are saying explicitly, unless you can picture an operation, that's to say do it geometrically in mathematics, you have not understood what's going on and you're liable to be led astray. And then there's a question of picturability as evidence. So although the bulk of attention on representation has been epistemological in the 17th century, one thing I want to show is, well, two things I want to show. One is that epistemological question is not sui generis. There's these four different sources, and if you pay attention to the cases you can choose, you'll see that some of the epistemological problems are caused by a lack of fit through the original things. Particularly, for example, through discussions in scholastic metaphysics about the representational nature of ideas, and discussions in optics, which now become crucial to vision, about the nature of optical images. They're not just versions of the same thing, they're quite different things, and bringing them together is almost inevitably going to generate all kinds of anomalies and lack of fit. So I would hope this account helps explain why you get the anomalies you do in epistemology, but I also wanted to open up other questions about representation in the 17th century, particularly picturability, because in epistemology, picturability kind of drops out in the 17th century. It's as if only the simple-minded kind of think in terms of pictures, sophisticated philosophers think in terms of abstractions, and you leave picturability well behind. But actually, I don't think that's the case.
Yes, I mean, it's very interesting what you said about Descartes, especially concerning the relation between algebra, addition, and the representation of that. And I mean your example with plus 3 equals 5, right? But that means, in a sense, that by mathematics we mean here fundamentally geometry, because we reduce everything to geometry, because mainly, probably of two things. This pictorial force in mathematical cognition given by images, right? And also because geometry was organized by century already axiomatically, right? So there are two main considerations. However, I think that Descartes is very special in the history of mathematics, because he's seen now classically as a forerunner of algebraization.
Yeah.
Because what is he doing in mathematics is decomposing an image, right, a figure, on the Cartesian coordinates. Namely, we are, in a sense, understanding images as numbers. But for numbers, we don't have this pictorial, vivid image. Especially, we have big troubles with 0 and infinite or huge numbers. So, in a sense, I think that Descartes is moving from putting a special emphasis on geometry to algebra, with a climax in Leibniz and Newton with the infinitesimal calculus. So I see things a little bit different. So.
No, I completely agree. But interestingly, what happens is that, I mean, Descartes himself extols the virtues of algebra over, or analysis, as he calls it, over geometry. Why? Well, he says algebra is more clear and distinct than geometry.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you think, well, why is that? Well, interestingly, there still remains a pictorial element. There's one example which I can't write, it's actually too complicated, but there's a geometrical demonstration. Now, as you know, once you get beyond kind of baby stuff in geometry, you don't just start from a problem and prove it. You've got all kinds of auxiliary constructions that you have to introduce on the way. That's what Descartes hones in on. He gives one point, he gives a geometrical demonstration that's got a few auxiliary constructions in it, and an algebraic proof of the same thing. And the thing about the algebraic proof is you've got an equal sign, you've got equations, you've got an equal sign, and the things have to equal one another up. So what you have to do is to juggle the bits round so that the unknown stands by itself on one side of the equation, and then you've got the solution. So you've got several knowns, several numbers mixed in together with the unknown. You've got to somehow move all the unknowns and numbers over to the other side of the equal sign in the right way, so that you only have the unknown on one side of the equals, and then you've solved the thing. And he shows how transparent this is, because you've kind of got the equal signs in the middle of the page, and you're just swapping stuff around, so it's highly pictorial. Whereas in the geometrical case, I mean, if you've ever tried to follow proofs in Huygens or Newton, for example, they're extremely difficult to follow, because they don't say this is an auxiliary construction. They just keep going on. And you think, well, why are we doing this? What's that got to do with anything? And you might have 4 pages where you're wondering why that's got to do with anything. And then all of a sudden you come back to solving the problem. I mean, it's not that they put in smaller print or in the margins or something. They're just there because these guys, you know, they live geometry. I suspect modern mathematicians who are not geometers, who are algebraicists or whatever, would have great difficulty following these proofs. They're abbreviated and the rest of it, so they're very hard to follow. And sometimes impossible to follow. So in Newton's mathematical papers, Whiteside, Descartes has a very famous algebraic proof of the so-called Pappus problem. And this is the real triumph, because he gives an algebraic proof of it, and this is a proof that geometers had never provided a proof of. He says it's not soluble in geometrical terms. Here's an example of the strength or force of my algebraic technique, and he solves it. Newton, who's very clever, actually gives the geometrical proof of it, according to Whiteside. And he says, here it is, and he gives a bit of commentary. And it's like 15 pages, and you think, you don't even think, has he proved it? You're thinking, where's the proof? I don't see any proof. It's very, very difficult to follow. So, in that sense, if what you're comparing is a complex geometrical demonstration that keeps taking you off the path, because it's going on all these indirect routes to prove auxiliary theorems and constructions and things, as opposed to just this line of equals, where you've got stuff on one side, stuff on the other, and you can see the stuff being transferred, then the algebraic case now looks more like the kind of line lengths and points.
Yeah, in this sense, I totally agree with you. But we need, I think, to distinguish between 2 notions of pictorial. One is using pictures in your demonstration, and the other way it's arranging a demonstration in a very pictorial way, namely to be very clear and easy going. And in this sense, for example, I think maybe more illustrative is Leibniz. He put a lot of emphasis on symbolization, especially because of the pictorial power of our mind. You know, he spent, I think, 6 months just for the symbol of integral, this sharps.
I didn't know that, really.
Yeah, and because he saw that it's very, very important, I mean, to have the right symbol. Because the right symbol gives you the capacity to sing many things together at once. And this is another sense of pictorial. It's something more abstract. And I think that in this sense, we can use your pictorial sense of arranging a proof, which is true. It's very important and very elegant and very compelling. And
right? Seeing, if you like.
Yes, exactly.
Seeing the first formula and seeing the last one and seeing that it's just a bit of swapping to get from one to the other, you actually do see what's going on. It is a great help. And you don't see that in the geometrical.
In modern world, for example, Frege is the one who used that a lot.
That's
to have a geometrical, pictorial representation of a proof.
No, you're quite right on the picturability thing. It's much more complicated than I've made out. Not because I'm keeping things back, I just haven't thought through what it is. I mean, it's very... Problems of representation here are very... I mean, there are other forms of representation that I haven't thought about and haven't looked into, like political representation. The stuff that Cantorius, like in the King's Two Bodies. Very, very complex symbolic forms of representation that are alive and well in people like Hobbes, but I don't think they feed into these kind of problems. But there are clearly, representation is clearly an extremely complex thing. Picturability perhaps less so, but the example you raised from Leibniz, yeah, I agree. There's a certain vagueness. The argument depends on a certain vagueness, and I would hope to clear up when you can identify problems caused by the vagueness. I would hope to clear them up, but I don't think you can just kind of clear it up like that.
Yeah, I have 2 questions which came to me while you were reading the book. Well, the paper. I don't know if they are legitimate, but I'm going to put them. First would be, if there is a similarity between this concept of vividness and the Hume's concepts of liveliness and vivacity of simple perceptions, it seems somehow that they try to grasp this kind of the same thing. I'm not sure, it was just an intuition. And the second, it is related with this idea that if you have a pictorial representation, or you have pictorial representation theory in the background, does this make analogy a very useful and legitimate method in the process of scientific discovery, in the exploratory part where you're trying to understand the phenomena? Does this way of, if you're just saying, well, everything is about picturing and grasping the correct picture, does this give a very powerful role for analogy and science be reduced, not reduced, but I don't know, generating useful analogies be one step in the exploratory process that could lead to a very good understanding of the investigative phenomenon? Those were the 2 questions.
No, that's great. On the Hume thing, it's certainly similar to things that are going on in Descartes. By the 18th century, clearly, the 17th century, some critics of Descartes, like Gassendi, criticised Hume's distinct ideas on the grounds of what's Hume's distinct idea. One person will be obscure and confused for another. But actually, that was very exceptional. Most people really liked, even the critics of Descartes, liked the idea of clarity and distinctness. And certainly the debates in mathematics and in natural philosophy hinge crucially on that. In natural philosophy, because people are asking themselves, what went wrong with Aristotle? And the most obvious thing for them that went wrong with Aristotle was that the explanations didn't explain anything. They were just forms of words. So there was a pressing question, what would an explanation that really explains something look like? What kind of qualities would it have? Clarity and distinctness were really crucial there. But in a more general psychological context, and I don't know enough about Hume, which we'll discover tomorrow. My sense is that the empiricist tradition is has a line on clarity and distinctness and vividness of ideas that is kind of quite important. So empiricist psychology from Locke, not Berkeley, who I think is an anomaly in many ways, but Locke, the French Lockeans, Condillac, Diderot, and then Hume, people like that. And then those people like Shaftesbury and Hutchinson, who have theories of aesthetics and things that work in terms of association of ideas and vivid ideas. There's certainly some kind of continuity, but I don't think it's a direct one with Descartes. It's once you get rid of the notion of innate ideas and have to start from a tabula rasa and start working out what the legitimacy of ideas, if nothing's innate, what does the legitimacy of ideas consist in? Then I think questions of vividness take on an even greater importance than in straight philosophy than they had previously. Analogies. That sounds right, but I can't think of any examples.
Well, I had in mind Descartes' example with the rainbow, and after using the prism experiment, he makes the analogy with what happens at the level of the theory of matter, that he speaks about small balls, rounds, and he uses a pictorial image in order to explain the way light moves.
Okay, yeah, that's a case, but that I think is a really interesting case, because that's a case where his concern with representation completely takes over. So Descartes' view of the nature of light, for those who are not familiar with it, is that light comes from an illuminating body like the sun in straight lines. And when it is reflected off the surface of objects that have different surface features, you think of light as a stream of corpuscles, which is, for these purposes, is kind of more or less right for Descartes. The corpuscles get a spin. They get knocked off the angular microsurfaces of objects, and they get a spin. And and this spin results in our seeing colour. So white light is homogeneous for Descartes as opposed to Newton's theory, where it's heterogeneous. It doesn't consist of rays of different colours. It's a completely homogeneous thing. It's just that when the corpuscles, which have just had a linear motion up to this point, hit the surface of the object, this knocks them into a spin, and then the faster the spin, the higher up the spectrum of colour that we perceive is. It's an ingenious account, and he tries to account for the angle at which the colours of the rainbow are formed on this basis, in terms of the angles at which they would hit a reflecting and then a refracting surface. And this helps him explain why rainbows are only formed when the light hits something at a very particular angle and not at other angles. It's because they hit it exactly right. This theory has no empirical content whatsoever. There's no way in which Descartes can say these things spin. There's no empirical evidence for it, there's no empirical justification for it. What it is something completely subordinate to picturability. He's got the linear motion. These light corpuscles have somehow got to become coloured. What do they do? Well, what he gives us with is what he provides us with is just something on a mechanical model, something nice and picturable. I mean, you don't have to do it in the way he does. You could keep it in a two-dimensional thing, so it's a vibration or a little sine wave function, so to speak, in the thing. But it's bigger and more striking if you can give the motion a third dimension, so that things move in a third dimension, rotating at speed. It's just the kind of thing that correlates. But in empirical terms, of course, it's completely empty. He's got no reason to think these things spin. There's nothing in his inquiry that suggests that at all. It's completely speculative and hypothetical. But what it does is it meets that mechanical model really well. And that's why people like it, because they say, okay, this is the one to beat. Because if you're going to explain things in microcorpuscularian terms, this is exactly the kind of thing we want. We know where we stand, you know, it might be false, it might be true, but we know exactly where we are with it, because it does things in microcorpuscular terms. Whereas Newton's didn't. Newton's account of colours didn't work in microcorpuscular terms at all. In fact, when Newton starts passing the thing through the prism, and he sees all the colours, which is lovely, but he's not mesmerised by the colours. What puzzles Newton is the fact that they're stretched and it's a lozenge shape, and there's no optical reason why the thing should have a lozenge shape. It should just be a nice spectrum. And that's what puts him onto the heterogeneity of light, something that the other people wouldn't notice, because lozenge shape, who cares what shape this thing is? It's not to do with geometrical optics, it's not to do with physical optics. It's just, one of those things that happen in life. It's got little rounded edges. So what? Whereas Newton, Newton's fascinated by this, rounded edges. Why on earth does he have rounded edges? So yeah, that's a case of a bad analogy though. But that microcorpuscularian model, of course, works on analogies. It works on analogy in the macroscopic and the microscopic. So things that are nice and picturable and physical on the macroscopic level, you just imagine what the analogue of that would be on the microscopic level, and that gives you the answer.
Yeah, I have a question about, actually want to return to the anomaly part debate.
Yeah.
Was there any concern in this prehistory that you talked about with the abstract general ideas that Berkeley criticizes and mocks, such as the idea of the triangle, for example, which is supposed to be all of these triangles and none of them at the same time, and Berkeley says, well, I had no way of framing this pictorial idea of this in my mind. Is there any concern with that in this period?
So the problem there, the Berkeley problem is, Locke says he can imagine the general triangle, but he can't, but it's not scaling, it's not equilateral, it's not this, it's not that. And Berkeley says, well, if it's none of the triangles, what is it you're imagining? Kind of thing. You can't imagine any triangle. I think that's a very distinctively epistemological problem about representation that would come when the things get off the ground, rather than at this pre-stage.
Yeah, I guess that was the worry. Like, did it show up at all in this scholastic period where you were talking about the formal concept, comparing it to the objective concept, which then is supposed to have some sort of relation to the object?
Not that I know of. I try to stay away from that scholastic stuff because it's endless and it's really hard to understand. But I do read secondary sources often. I haven't come across anything like the Coimbra commentators would maybe talk about that kind of stuff. But so far as I know, no, I think that's a problem that's distinctive of a fully fledged notion of representation in an explicit epistemological context. Yeah. I mean, Descartes talks about indeterminate ideas and how you can't, in the reguli, and how you can't, how you've got to make ideas determinate before you can do anything with them. And on the face of it, that sounds like it might relate to that question, but since there's nothing explicit, and since the Berkeley case is such a nice one, that when you see the argument, you think, yeah, that's right, and why did no one before Berkeley see that?
Well, I thought it was important to geometrical proof, though. That's why I went on to a selective attention theory with particular triangles, where you don't attend to any of the qualities like the lengths of the sides or the values of the angles in order to prove general truths about triangles. So it might be also relevant to the case number 4 that you talked about.
Right. But doesn't he also want them to be kind of empirical and physical? He doesn't. I mean, he's so specific that he thinks that.
Yeah, he says, what is it? It's like, I will start with the image of an isosceles rectangular triangle in my mind, and from that I will prove such and such interior angles are equal to 180 degrees without, or to 2 right ones, without making any appeal to the particular value of the sides or the value of the angle.
mean, the only thing about Berkeley is that it's an explicit picturability argument. I mean, if someone says, I can conceive of a triangle, but I can only picture to myself particular kinds of triangles, then obviously the argument's not going to work. So there's an assumption that what Locke's claiming, I think what the empiricist tradition claims, is that these things are picturable. Whatever you've got is whatever you've got in your mind, if it's genuinely there and you've got a genuine grasp of it, you're representing it to yourself in some kind of a quasi-pictorial form.
Just the question of whether that form can be general or it has to be particular.
Well, can you have a pictorial representation? I mean, Berkeley's argument seems pretty decisive to me there.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, if you're talking real picturability, it can't be general.
Right.
It's got to have, that comes with properties. So, unless, I don't know, there might be some ingenious way of conceiving a triangle so that they morph into one another, and that's what your general idea is. But,
I have another question. When you talk about the optical theories, those theories of vision, did they overthrow or not the idea that Aristotle had about sense perception? Because it wasn't very clear to me from the paper, and probably you stated, but I don't really recall. And why I'm asking is that something struck me now, it may not be correct. It appears to me that Aristotle's theory of sense perception, although I don't really know it, but in the way he presented it, shares some common features with today's ecological theory of perception, in which you have the same idea that the information is in the medium, that you don't have the representation of the information, it's just the direct contact between you and the medium, which provides the information at the level of the senses, and so you operate with it. What happens at the representational level, it's a different thing, and it's not related to perception. So, I guess that there are many differences, but they seem to somehow share some common features. So what I was asking is, if today we have an operating theory of ecological theory of perception, which functions very well, although we do know how the visual system and the auditory system works, it means that you can separate the theory of perception from the internal theory of how the organisms, or I don't know, the mechanistic and how the brain works. So you can have two separate levels of, so I think that Kepler's idea on optics could not have overthrown.
Well, it shows that, it forces people to take optics seriously. Once you take optics seriously, you've got to take diffraction seriously. And if the Aristotelian theory says that the only veridical form of perception is unmediated perception, then there's no veridical form of perception anymore, because it's all refracted. It depends on the lens, depends on the curvature of the lens, and everything. But what you said, well, generally, I think puts it in a really important issue. There is someone in the 17th century who does work along those lines, but interestingly, he does it all in terms of representation, and that's Arnaud. Arnaud criticises Malebranche's representation of theory of perception. Malebranche has quite an extreme view of perception. Malebranche says that what you know, what you perceive, is not the world, but representations of the world. And he sets up the veil of ideas, veil of ignorance model, whereby you could never know whether your representations of the world corresponded to what there is in the world, because you can only ever know anything through representation. So you can't go to the world and compare it with the representation. That's not possible. So you can only ever know representation. So you're stuck with your representations. Arnaud says this is a misunderstanding. That it's not that what Malebranche has done, he's kind of ontologized the idea of representation, and that you can't do that. It's not that you... So, the way I would put it is that to have a visual representation of the world is just another way of seeing you see the world. To have a visual representation of the bottle is just the same as saying, I see the bottle. But they're in two different modes. One's a kind of physiological, optical mode, and one's a psychological, epistemological mode. They're two different kinds of description of exactly the same thing. Whereas what Malebranche has done is taken them as two stages of the same thing. He's taken them as a physiological, optical process, and then as this intellectual, epistemological process. So he's said the physical bit happens, then comes the psychological, epistemological bit, in which you access your representation of the world. That's completely wrong, says Arno. It's not that there's two stages. These are just two ways of describing the same thing. To say you have visual representations of the world is not to say there's some third thing between your mind and the world, which is the visual representation. It's just a particular mode of speech. It's a particular way of describing in physiological, optical terms what's going on. It's not in contradiction with the statement that you see things in the world. Now, what's interesting about, and that, if you push that, it looks a bit like those J.J. Gibson, those ecological theories of perception. This is a really interesting theory now, and you can imagine how it could be followed up into that. But unlike Gibson and co, he's locked into the vocabulary of representation. He won't everyone discusses perception in terms of representations. And Arnaud gets marginalised, I think, because if representation is the core issue, and there's all these nice juicy epistemological issues about whether you can know whether your representations actually represent the world, there's all this kind of untapped philosophical substance in the Malebranche thing, and then Berkeley rewrites Malebranche a little bit in his own terms. And you get all these kind of skeptical induced problems, but you don't get any of those philosophical problems in Arnaud. His contemporaries probably thought, because this is not philosophically very interesting, I think it's because he's got the right answer. He solved kind of the basic problem, and all those other problems that lead right up to sense data are all pseudo problems, rather than sound like a positivist. I mean, it's like Austin in the 20th century in Sense and Sensibilia about evidence. He says, people arguing against sense data. He says, if I'm standing at a wall and I hear all these grunting noises coming from behind the wall, that's evidence of a pig. And if there's a foul smell comes, that's more evidence that there's a pig. And if there's a sign that says, caution pigs, that's even more evidence. But if the pig suddenly comes into view, that's not more evidence that there's a pig, that's a pig. It's not evidence anymore, it's a pig. And the problem is when you start extrapolating and thinking that, I see a bottle, this is really compelling evidence that there's a bottle there. It's not, it's just seeing the bottle, it's got nothing to do with evidence. And that, I think, locks into the Arnaud thing as well, because that's how the Malebranche view of representation gets going, that representations are, reliable or unreliable, they correspond or fail to correspond. What evidence do we have that our representation of the bottle corresponds to that is caused by there being a bottle there? You get all these problems generated, and I think you're right that there is what's called an ecological theory of perception that, has its issues. They all do, but it seems to me to resolve many of those fundamental problems.
I would like to ask something connected with two problems discussed earlier, namely the use of microcorpuscular explanations and the problem of self-conviction. When Descartes published his discourse together with the three essays, he was very careful in choosing the publisher in order to have a good representation of the diagrams and the illustrations he introduced into the book. Yet after 1 year, he was not very well convinced of the kind of microcorpuscular explanation he provided in the case of one illustration. I'm referring to the representation of water particles in meteorology. So,
Is this the one with the beads in the vat?
no, not that one. The one with water vapors and their shapes. And after that, he said that it doesn't matter whether the water particles have that particular shape. What is important is the mechanical explanation provided there. So I'm not quite sure whether we can say here that self-conviction is used in order to convince the others.
No, in their case, I think there's a level of pure mechanics which includes the laws of collision, basically. There's not much more than that. And then there's an extrapolation to the celestial, to the structure of the cosmos and the formation of the cosmos and the solar system. But once you get past a purely mechanical level, he goes into what he regards as the more speculative thing about the shape of things made from corpuscles. So water's not a particular shape of corpuscle, it's a conglomeration of microcorpuscles. And when he starts talking about those things, water, magnetism, basic chemistry like sulfur and things like that, then I think he himself thinks it's pretty speculative how these work. I think he realises that pure mechanics isn't going to work at that level. It depends how the microcorpuscles are put together. But he doesn't have a theory like that, that's fine. Except in the case of magnetism, where he has something like colours, where he just makes up this thing about right-handed and left-handed screws so that things screw into one another, and that's like magnetic attraction or repulsion. So he doesn't have much of a theory there. So in that case, I mean, on the foundations of mechanics, I think he'd say that it's got to be self-evident and clear and the rest of it. Once you leave that level, which of course you leave very quickly in the Principia, for example, then then I think he's open to suggestions to the extent to which Descartes ever open to suggestions. I think he's not going to argue on the shape of particular meso things.